The dust inside that little church was so thick you could taste it, a fine grit settling on everything. It covered the rough pine benches and coated the tongues of the few folks gathered there. They were all there to watch. It was a Tuesday in a town that had not seen a drop of rain in 6 long months. Outside, the air shimmered with a blistering heat, but inside that stuffy little building, the feeling was ice cold. Evelyn stood at the altar, her small hand trembling in the grip of the man beside her. She was just 18 years old. The man, Harlan Riggs, was rumored to be much older. Some said he was 40, maybe even 50. Nobody knew for certain, and nobody was brave enough to ask. He was a man with land, a widower 2 times over, with a ranch that sprawled across 3 whole counties. He carried a silence that was heavier than any shout could ever be. His thumb pressed hard into the back of her hand, a gesture that said she belonged to him now. All the while, her own father, the preacher, was rushing through the wedding words. Evelyn stared at the cracked wooden cross hanging behind her daddy's head. She just could not look at him. She could not face the man who had traded her away, his only daughter, all to cover a gambling debt, a debt that had brought shame to his church and ruined their good name. The whispers had been following him for weeks, and this wedding right here was the only thing that could quiet those whispers. That and the heavy purse of money Harlan had brought to their house just 2 nights before. "And do you, Evelyn, take this man?" She could feel Harlan's eyes on her, hot and heavy like the air outside. She could smell the sour whiskey on his breath, a foul note mixed in with the smell of sweat and dust. She felt like she was going to choke. She wanted to run so badly. But then she saw her father's desperate, pleading eyes, and she saw how thin her mother looked. Sitting right there in the front pew, a woman worn down to almost nothing by her husband's mistakes. "I do." The words were just a whisper, swallowed up by the dry air. But it was enough. Harlan's grip tightened, nearly bruising her fingers as he shoved a thick gold band onto her hand. The ring was too big for her. It felt more like a shackle. The walk from that church to Harlan's ranch house on the edge of the parched town was just a blur. The man did not even own a buggy. He made her walk right beside him, his hand clamped down on her upper arm. The white dress she wore, the one her mother had remade for her, was already getting stained with the pale orange dust from the road. All the townsfolk just watched from their porches. Their faces were blank, offering not a single bit of comfort. She was property now, being moved from one owner to the next. His house was large and dark, and it smelled of stale tobacco and old regrets. Old sorrow. A lone servant girl, with her eyes fixed on the floor, scampered off as they came in. "Get on upstairs," Harlan grunted, letting go of her arm just to give her a hard shove toward the staircase. She climbed, and every single step felt like a hammer pounding against her heart. The bridal suite, that's what he had called it, the very same room where his other wives had laid their heads. It was lit by just one candle on the nightstand, making long, devilish shadows dance on the walls. The room was clean as a pin, but it felt cold and empty. A big, heavy bed frame, a wash basin, and a tall wardrobe. Harlan came in right behind her and shut the door. The sound of that lock clicking into place made her jump right out of her skin. He didn't even look at her. He just walked over to the wash basin, poured a tall glass of whiskey from a fancy bottle, and threw it back in one single swallow. Then he poured another. Evelyn just stood by the door, clutching her hands so tight her fingernails were digging right into her own palms. Now she was a preacher's daughter. She knew what was coming, she knew her wifely duty, but her whole body was frozen stiff with a kind of terror that went way beyond simple wedding night jitters. No, this was not nerves. This was the cold, hard feeling that something awful was about to happen. Harlan turned, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, and his eyes raked over her. "Take it off," he ordered. She fumbled with the tiny pearl buttons on her dress, her fingers feeling all numb and clumsy. "Slow," he growled, sitting on the edge of the bed. The old ropes groaned underneath his heavy weight. "I want to watch." She turned her back to him, a small, pointless attempt to keep a little dignity. As she worked on those buttons, her eyes were darting all over the room, desperate for anything, for some little sign that this was a normal, safe place. And that is when she saw it. Hanging from a peg on the wall, right near the wardrobe, was a thick leather strap. It was not the kind of belt a man uses to hold up his britches. This one was heavy, dark, and slick with oil, coiled up like a rattler in the dim light. Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers froze solid. She had to force her eyes away, down to the little nightstand beside the bed. The drawer was cracked open just a little bit. Something inside it glinted in the candlelight. It was metal. She took one shaky step closer, pretending she was just looking at a loose thread on the quilt. She nudged the drawer open a little more with her hip. A pair of metal cuffs lay right inside, nestled up against a small box lined with velvet. A cold, sharp scream tried to claw its way right up her throat, but she swallowed it back down. This was no bridal suite. This was a butcher's room. That strap on the wall, the metal cuffs in the drawer. A cold thought of his other wives, both buried young. "I told you once, take it off," Harlan said again, his voice getting low and dangerous. He pushed himself up. The sound of his boots on the wooden floorboards shattered the silence. A pure, gut-deep fear washed right over her. It drowned out her duty. It drowned out her shame. It drowned out everything but the one thing that mattered: the need to stay alive. He made a grab for her, then she ran. There was no time for thinking. She just yanked at the door handle, forgetting all about the lock, and threw her shoulder hard into the wood. A sharp pain shot straight up her arm. Harlan let out a laugh, a low and ugly sound. "Got nowhere to run, little rabbit." But he was wrong about that. She spotted the window. It looked out over the back of the house, away from town, pointing toward the dark, empty canyons. In a flash, she grabbed the heavy water pitcher off the washstand and she slung it with all her might. It flew past his head, shattering into 1,000 pieces against the wall. But that surprise bought her a precious second. She snatched up the wooden chair and just shoved it right through the thin glass of the window. The cold night air rushed in and hit her face. "You little hellcat!" he roared, lunging for her. And she scrambled right through the busted frame, not even feeling the sharp glass that ripped her dress and cut up her arms. She hit the ground hard, landing in the soft dirt of a long-dead flower bed, and the breath got knocked right out of her. Inside, she could hear him stomping around the room, bellowing her name. She pushed herself up to her feet and took off running. Still wearing that white wedding dress with nothing on her feet, she ran from that house, flew across the dusty yard, past the quiet old barn, and straight into the thorny scrub brush that was the start of the wild country. She had no idea where she was going. All she knew was she had to get away from the sour smell of whiskey and the awful sight of that coiled leather belt. Then, behind her, she heard somebody holler, "Get the horses! Go find her! She belongs to me!" Lights started flickering on in the ranch hand's bunkhouse. Then the dog started barking. Evelyn dove into the deep darkness of the canyon, her white dress glowing like a beacon in the moonlight. She clawed at the skirt, ripping the heavy cloth away just so she could move better. But the top of the dress, it was cinched too tight, squeezing the air from her lungs. She stumbled on loose rocks, her bare feet slicing open on the sharp stones. The sagebrush grabbed at her like thorny fingers, tearing the fine lace of her dress and the skin right underneath. She could hear the horses now, the steady drum of their hooves and the rough shouts of Harlan's men getting closer. She ran and ran until her lungs were on fire and her legs felt like jelly. She scrambled up a steep, rocky hill, her hands all raw and bleeding, and then her foot slipped and she went tumbling, back down into a dry wash. She lay there for a moment, gasping for air, tasting the salt of her own tears mixed with the coppery taste of blood. The moon slipped behind a cloud, plunging the whole canyon into an inky blackness. The sounds of the chase seemed to move on past her, further up the canyon. She had a moment's peace. She crawled on her hands and knees into a thorny patch of mesquite, pulling her torn dress around her, trying to hide the white fabric in the darkness. She huddled down, shivering, as two riders passed so close she could smell the sweat of their tired horses. They did not see her. She waited, every single muscle screaming, until their sounds faded off into the distance. A deep silence fell, broken only by her own ragged breathing and the lonesome cry of a distant coyote. She knew she could not stay there. They would find her at dawn. She forced her aching body to move, to crawl out of that wash and get to her feet. She moved deeper into the wilderness, away from the town, away from that ranch, toward the high, cold ridges that seemed to touch the sky. The air grew thin and sharp. The temperature plummeted. The rocks were like knives underfoot, but her feet were so numb she could barely feel them. She walked for what felt like hours, or maybe it was only minutes. Time had lost all its meaning. There was only the biting cold, the pain, and the crushing weight of what she had been forced to do. She was a runaway wife. She was ruined in their eyes. She climbed until her legs just gave out. She reached a high, windswept ridge, the ground hard and completely barren. The wind cut through the tattered remains of her dress as if she were wearing nothing at all. She stumbled, her ankle turning, and fell hard to the frozen ground. She tried to get up. Her body just would not obey. The cold had seeped deep into her bones, a heavy exhaustion pulling her down. She was so very tired. She curled into a small ball on the frozen ground, the shredded white silk of her dress, a cruel joke about the innocence she had run to save. She closed her eyes. It would be warm soon. Now Colt hated towns. He hated the smell of them, the noise of them, and most of all the people who lived in them, passing judgment with their narrow eyes. He kept to the mountains, trapping and hunting, coming down only when the seasons made him, to trade his pelts for salt, coffee, and fresh cartridges. He was tracking a buck high on the ridges, looking for one last bit of winter meat before the real snows hit. His horse, a steady gray gelding, moved carefully. Named Quiet, was picking his way careful-like over the pre-dawn shale. Colt was already getting irritated. That buck was long gone, spooked by who knows what. He was just about to turn on back when Quiet just froze solid, lifting his head and snorting loud, his ears pointed straight ahead. "What is it, boy?" Colt whispered, his hand moving on its own to the rifle in its scabbard. He searched the whole ridge line. There was nothing there, just rock and the skeleton of a long-dead pine tree. And then he saw it. It was just a little patch of white, all crumpled up against the dark earth, looking for all the world like an early patch of snow. But it surely was not snow. He swung down from his saddle, rifle in hand, and walked toward it real slow. It was a woman. She was laying on her side, kind of curled up. Her dark hair spilled out against the white of her dress. She was wearing a fine white dress, now torn all to ribbons. Her feet were bare, just caked with dried blood and mud. Colt stopped a good 10 feet away. Now this here was trouble. The kind of trouble that could get a man hanged. A white woman, all alone on his mountain, looking like this. He wanted no part of it. He ought to just ride on by. Just turn his horse and forget he ever saw this. He'd spent years learning to stay clear of folks. And this was folks at their very worst, crawling up his mountain just to die. He took a step back. Then the woman let out a low, broken little moan, a sound so quiet the wind almost carried it away. He swore a loud, sharp curse into the cold air. He just could not leave her. He could not be the kind of fella who'd ride past a dying creature, even if that creature was a human one. He slung his rifle over his back and knelt down beside her. He gently touched her neck. The skin was ice cold, but there was a pulse, faint and thin as a spider's silk. Her face was all bruised up. Her lips were blue. "Ma'am," he said, nudging her shoulder. She did not move a muscle. He sighed, his breath a white cloud in the air. He had a small hunting cabin not 2 miles from here, a place he used for trapping in the deep of winter. It was rough, but it was a roof over her head. He looked down at her frail body. She weighed next to nothing. He slid his arms under her, one beneath her knees, the other behind her back, and lifted her up. She was as light as a bundle of dry sticks, and every bit as cold. The fabric of her dress was stiff with frost. He carried her over to Quiet, who shied away from the strange, limp burden. "Easy now, boy. It's just trouble." He managed to swing up into the saddle, settling her across his lap, her head leaning against his chest. She was burning up with a fever. The coldness of her skin was just a lie. Underneath it, a terrible fever was raging. He urged his horse into a careful walk, using his own body to shield her from the biting wind as best he could. He rode on back to the cabin, a little one-room shelter tucked up tight against a rock face, almost invisible till you were right on bottom of it. He kicked the door open and carried her right inside. The cabin was cold and dark as a tomb. He laid her down gently on the narrow cot, which was nothing more than a wooden frame with ropes strung across it, covered by a thin mattress and a pile of old wool blankets. He got to work right away. He got a fire going in the stone fireplace, the dry wood catching with the satisfying roar. He lit the oil lamp, and in that flickering yellow light, he got his first real good look at her. She was young, maybe 18, 19 at most. Her face was caked with dirt and streaked with dried tears. But she was beautiful in a pale, fragile kind of way. Her hands were all torn to pieces, and her feet were just a bloody mess. He went to the small spring out behind the cabin and broke through the thin ice to fill a bucket. He brought it back inside, setting it near the fire to warm up, and tore a clean strip from an old shirt. He started with her feet. He had to be gentle, washing away all the grit and the dried blood, trying to figure out how bad the damage was. The cuts were deep, and as the warm water touched her skin, she began to shiver, a violent rattle and tremor that shook the whole cot. Her eyes fluttered open, but they weren't really focused. They were just winded, dark, and filled with pure terror. "No," she whispered, her voice a dry, scratchy rasp. "Please do not. Please do not." "You're safe, ma'am," Colt said gruffly. "I'm just cleaning you up. You were nearly frozen." She thrashed about, trying to pull away from him. "The belt, I saw it. He is coming." Colt frowned, concerned. He put a hand on her shoulder to steady her. "There is no one else here. Just me. You are in my cabin." Her eyes finally landed on his face. The terror slowly faded, replaced by a deep, fever-bright confusion. She looked up at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, then at the fire, and then her gaze came back to him. A small, strange smile touched her cracked lips. "Oh," she breathed, "you are an angel. Am I, am I dead?" Colt pulled his hand back like he had been burned. "No, ma'am, you are not dead. You are in the high country. Now you hold still." He went back to cleaning her feet, his touch all business. He found a small tin of pine tar salve and applied it to the worst of the cuts. She whimpered when he wrapped her feet in clean rags, but she did not pull away again. She just watched him, her eyes heavy-lidded. He tended the gashes on her arms and hands from the window glass. He brought her a cup of lukewarm water from the bucket, holding her head up so she could drink. She took 2 small sips and fell back, her eyes closing. He stood up, looking down at her. She was a mess of contradictions. A fine white dress, ruined, bare, bloody feet, a fever that was making her see angels. He wanted her story, but he knew better than to ask. Asking was an invitation. Asking meant he was involved. He was already involved. He took his heaviest wool blanket and laid it over her. She burrowed into it, the shivering easing. He sat in the cabin's only other chair, a 3-legged stool he had made himself, and began cleaning his rifle. He did not sleep. He watched her, and he watched the fire. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin, and with the wind came the snow. It began as a few lazy flakes drifting past the cabin's single small window. But by morning, it was a blinding, swirling curtain of white. Evelyn woke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke. Her body ached in places she did not know she had. Her feet were on fire, a dull, throbbing pain. Her throat was raw. She opened her eyes. She was in a small, dark room. A fire crackled in a hearth. She was in a bed, buried under a mountain of heavy blankets. A man sat at a small table, his back to her, sharpening a knife. The memories came back in a rush. The wedding, the belt, the handcuffs, the window, the chase, the cold. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness sent her crashing back onto the thin mattress. The man turned. He was not Harland. He was tall, even sitting, with broad shoulders that filled out his flannel shirt. His hair was dark and long, tied back at the nape of his neck. He had a beard, not a neat town beard, but a rough, wild one. His face was all harsh angles, weathered by wind and sun. He looked at her, his eyes a pale, clear gray, and they held no welcome. They just looked. "You're awake," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones, rubbing his hands together for warmth. Evelyn flinched back. Who are you? Where am I?" "Name's Colt. This here's my trapping cabin. You're up on Bear Ridge." He nodded toward a tin mug of broth sitting on the hearth. You best drink that. You've been out cold for 2 whole days. 2 days? Her eyes went to the window. It was just a solid sheet of white. It's snowing, she whispered. Been snowing a while now, he corrected her gently. Reckon we're snowed in under 10, maybe 12 feet. In the drifts, we're trapped. That word, trapped, hit her like a physical blow. She'd run from one prison, only to find herself in another. She took a good, long look at the man. He was a big fella, stronger even than Harland, and they were completely alone. What is it you want from me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He just raised an eyebrow and went right back to working on his knife. The steady sound of the whetstone scraping against steel was the only thing that filled the quiet little cabin. Right now, he said without looking up, I want this blade sharp enough to skin a rabbit. After that, I'll likely be wanting to eat that rabbit. His answer threw her for a loop. He did not sound mean. He did not sound dangerous. He just sounded matter of fact. You found me out there, she said, nearly frozen solid. He finally looked at her. Reckon you were lucky or unlucky, dependent on your point of view. The question she was terrified to ask got stuck in her throat. Her hand instinctively went to the collar of her tattered dress. It was still on, thank God, though it was ripped and stained something awful. He seemed to understand her fear without her saying a word. He kept his eyes on his work. I cleaned up your feet and your hands, pulled some glass from your arms and wrapped them up. Nothing else. A decent man doesn't take advantage of a woman who's half gone. She let out a long, shaky breath she did not even know she was holding. He was a gruff man, no doubt about it, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a tiny spark of safety. His quiet way of keeping to himself was a relief after the smothering, demanding presence of Harlan. For the next 3 days, they just existed inside that little cabin. The whole world got as small as those 4 log walls. The storm raged on outside, a constant howling wind. But inside, it was quiet, with just the crackle of the fire and the sound of Colt tending to his traps and the scrape of her spoon in a bowl. He was a man who did not waste words. He fed her warm broth, and later, when she got some strength back, tough biscuits softened in a hearty stew. He changed the bandages on her feet every single morning. His touch was firm and businesslike, his eyes never looking anywhere but at her injuries. He never once asked her name. He never asked how she ended up on his mountain ridge wearing a wedding dress. He did not ask where she came from or who might be looking for her. And his silence, his refusal to ask a single question, was the most surprising thing of all. It was the strangest thing of all, and it left her plain confused. He gave her space, but it was a cold, empty kind of space. He never once laid a hand on her. He slept on the floor by the fire, all rolled up in his bedroll, with his back to her, his rifle always close by. That part puzzled her too. Now Harlan's hands were on her in a heartbeat, always pinching, gripping, and claiming what he thought was his. But this man, Colt, he seemed to take up no more room than he absolutely had to. He was like a shadow. You could feel he was there, but he was not a threat. Not in the way Harlan was, that was for sure. On the 4th day, the snow finally stopped falling. The silence that came after was sudden and complete. Evelyn was strong enough to sit up, resting her feet on a stool. The fever was gone, but it left behind a weariness that went clear to the bone and a nagging fear of whatever was coming next. That night, the cabin got mighty warm. The fire was roaring, and Colt seemed restless. He shucked off his heavy flannel shirt to chop a new stack of kindling, not wanting to open the door and let all that cold air rush back in. He worked over in the corner with his back to her, wearing only his undershirt, which was thin and worn. After a moment, he pulled that off too. His skin was gleaming with a light sweat in the firelight. And Evelyn watched. She knew she should have looked away. Her father would have called it sinful. Harlan would have called it an invitation. But she just kept watching. His back was a landscape of hard muscle and old scars. He swung that hatchet with an easy, powerful grace. The muscles in his shoulders and arms were tightening and releasing with every swing. He was not a soft man. He was built from the same hard, unforgiving stuff as the very mountains he lived in. He was all corded muscle and lean strength. his skin browned by a sun she had not seen in days. Now she had been terrified of Harlan's body, which was all soft flesh and a heavy, possessive weight. But she was not terrified of Colt's. She watched him lift a heavy log and place it on the chopping block. She watched the line of his spine as he bent, the ripple of his back as he brought the hatchet down hard. Something stirred deep inside her, right underneath all the layers of shame and fear and duty. It was a feeling she had no name for. It was not a gentle feeling. It was a low, pulling ache, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was brand new, and it frightened her almost as much as her escape had. The world outside the cabin was a great white silence. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world buried in white. The sun was just a pale, faraway circle in a cold blue sky. Inside, Evelyn's strength came back to her, slow and painful, bit by bit. At first, it was a victory just to sit up on the cot without the room starting to spin. Then she managed to stand on her own 2 feet, the bandages on her soles feeling thick, her balance all wobbly. That cabin was tiny, but it felt as big as a dance hall in her first try to walk across it. She made it all the way to the fireplace, her hands pressed flat against the cold stones, and felt a little flicker of pride in her chest. Colt watched her the whole time, but he said not a word. He had given her one of his old wool shirts, and it hung on her small frame like a tent. The sleeves were rolled up at least 10 times, and a pair of trousers he had found in his pack were held up with a piece of rope. The white wedding dress lay in a crumpled heap in the corner. A ruined, muddy ghost of a thing. She refused to even look at it. She started to make a little space for herself in the cabin. She found his worn-out broom and swept the floor, sending up a little cloud of dust and ash. She straightened his stack of animal pelts. She washed his few dishes in a bucket of melted snow, her hands turning bright red in the freezing water. These were things a woman does, the kind of work she knew. They anchored her in that small, rough place. She could be useful. She was not just a victim. She was not a runaway anymore. She was simply a person who cooked and cleaned. Then she found a small sack of flour and a little tin of baking soda. That afternoon, she managed to make some decent-looking flatbread right on the hearthstone. When Cole came back in from checking on his horse, the cabin smelled of something more than just wood smoke and curing hides. He stopped dead in his tracks, sniffing the air. He saw the bread cooling on the table. "I made some," she said, her voice just a whisper, afraid he might be angry. But he just grunted and pulled off his heavy coat. He tore off a piece of the bread and ate it, chewing real slow. He looked right at her and said, "It's good." She felt a warmth spread through her that was way bigger than it should have been for just one little compliment. That night, as she stirred a thin stew she had made from one of his snared rabbits, he finally broke the quiet that had settled down between them. "The snow's packed down hard on the ridges," he said without even looking at her. He was busy oiling his rifle, the steady click and scrape, a familiar sound in the little cabin. "The wind's been at it, scoured the pass clean. Another week, maybe 2. It'll be clear enough to ride." Evelyn's hand just froze on the wooden spoon. "Soon as it's ready," he went on, "I'll be taking you back to town." The wooden spoon dropped right out of her hand, clattering on the floor and splashing hot broth everywhere. She just stared at that little puddle, feeling her heart turn to a block of ice. Back to town, she saw the old church steeple. She saw the desperation in her own father's eyes. She could almost taste the dust from that long road. She saw that leather belt, coiled up like a rattler on the wall. She saw the shine of cold metal, peeking out of a drawer. "No," the word barely escaped her lips, like a choked little whisper. Colt stopped what he was doing. He turned and looked straight at her. "Sir, no," she said, a bit louder this time. She started backing away from the fire, making sure that cot was right between the two of them. "I will not go back. You cannot make me go." He got to his feet, nice and slow, and set his rifle down. He was not the kind of man who made sudden moves. He was not a jumpy fellow. "I am not making you do a thing," he said, "but you are from town. You belong back in town. You surely can't stay out here." "And why not?" she challenged, even though her voice was trembling. "Because this is no place for a lady." Winter has not even hit us for real yet. This here is a trapper's line, not a home. I am not. I am not the kind of man to be keeping a woman out here. The panic was like a wild animal clawing its way up her throat. She had to make him see. She just had to stop him. Going back to Harlan was not an option, but telling this stranger the whole truth, she could not do that either. The honest-to-God truth, a wife who runs off is a criminal in the eyes of the law, and a man who helps her is just as guilty. They would likely hang him for stealing another man's property. "He'll put an end to me," she whispered. The words were barely out. Colt's brow furrowed. "Who?" "Harlan. Harlan Riggs." Saying the name felt like filling her mouth with ash. "Your man?" Colt's voice was flat, giving nothing away. His eyes were like stone. She needed a lie. She had to think of a lie, and fast. Something close enough to the truth that it would sound real. "He is my stepfather." The lie just hung there in the air of that little cabin. It felt flimsy, weak. My father. He passed on. My mother, she went and married Harlan. He is a hard, cruel man. He wanted things. She could not bring herself to finish the sentence. She just looked down at her own hands. "He put his hands on me for years. That night, he tried something else. So I ran. I just ran from him." She finally looked up, her eyes flooding with tears that were all too real. She was not faking the terror in her heart. "If you take me back there, he will find me. He will either lock me away or he will put me in the ground. Please, I am begging you, do not take me back." Colt just watched her for a long moment. He was a man who knew the wilderness like the back of his hand, and he knew a trap when he saw one. And something told him this young woman was lying. Her story was just a little too perfectly planned and too all over the place at the same time. Stepfathers do not usually chase girls out into the wild with a whole pack of men. And girls running from a mean stepfather, well, they do not usually run quite like this, in a white wedding dress. But he also saw the pure terror in her eyes, and that was not a lie. He had seen that kind of fear before, in a deer cornered by wolves. He knew the name Harlan Riggs. Everyone in this territory knew it. A man who owned half the valley and had a reputation for breaking things, whether it was horses, men, and it was rumored, even his first two wives. He looked at her, this small, desperate woman in his oversized shirt. He had his own secrets. He had his own past, a past that made him an outcast. He understood better than most the need to run. He turned back to his rifle, picking up the oil rag. "Riggs," he said, the name a hard stone in the air. "I know the name." He did not call her a liar. He did not press her. He just gave one sharp nod. "Eat your stew. It is getting cold." It was not forgiveness. It was not acceptance. It was a truce. He would not take her back. Not yet. The lie and his quiet acceptance of it changed the air in the cabin. They were no longer a rescuer and a victim. They were two people in a box waiting out the snow. The silence that fell between them was different. It was no longer empty. It was shared. They began to talk, but not about the past. The past was a locked door neither of them dared to knock on. They talked about small things, safe things. He told her how to read the sky, how the color of the sunset could predict the next day's weather. He taught her the names of the barrier birds that wintered in the high country. She told him about the few books she had read, describing worlds so far from this hard, cold place. She spoke of the sea, which she had read about but had never seen. He listened. When she spoke, his full attention was on her. He did not fidget or interrupt. He just listened, his pale gray eyes seeming to absorb her words. It was a new feeling to be listened to. Her father preached. Harlan commanded. This man, he just was. She watched his hands. They were large, calloused, and scarred, but they were gentle. She saw him reset a rabbit's broken leg caught in a small trap, his touch surprisingly delicate as he worked on the small creature before letting it go. "No sense in a slow death," he had muttered. She saw him with his horse, quiet when he went to the lean-to to feed him. He would speak to the animal in a low, soft rumble, his hand rubbing the horse's neck with a real tenderness. He never let on, though. She just watched his hands work, mending a leather harness, that needle and all moving so sure and steady, it was almost pretty. Then one night, the little cabin got all thick with steam. He'd hauled in 2 big buckets of snow and set 'em to melting over the fire, just for a bath. He gave her the cabin all to herself, waiting outside in the bitter cold for a good half-hour while she washed up. It was a kindness that just knocked her sideways. Now it was his turn. He took the bucket to the corner, his back turned to her, washing the trail grit right off his skin. She was laying on the cot, her own hair still damp and feeling clean for the first time in a week, pretending to be asleep. But she wasn't. She watched him through her eyelashes, seeing how the firelight danced across his back. That same back she'd seen before. He moved over to the basin on the table to wash his face, pouring that hot water over his head and down his neck. He scrubbed hard at his beard, then leaned forward, his hands braced on that little wobbly table, his head hanging low. She figured he was done. So she opened her eyes, and he was staring right at her. He was looking at her through the steam coming off the water, his hair dripping wet, his face all sharp lines and shadows. It wasn't a look of want, not the way Harlan used to look at her. No, this was something deeper, something sharper. It was a look of a deep, aching hunger. The look of a man who's been alone for a long, long time. She didn't move a muscle, didn't hardly breathe. He saw her eyes were open. A dark, slow red crept right up his neck. He looked away fast, snatching up a towel and turning his back to her again, his shoulders set like stone. But she didn't look away. Not this time. She kept on watching his back, feeling her heart beat a strange, slow rhythm against her ribs. The snow finally started to give way under that high, hard sun. The big drifts began to shrink, showing the hard, frozen ground underneath. Evelyn was set on helping. She was tired of that cot, tired of being cooped up in the cabin. She just needed to feel the air on her skin. He said, "I need to go check my traps on the South Ridge," as he pulled on his boots. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice a little shaky. "It's a 2-hour ride, ground's rough." "I can ride," she told him. It wasn't exactly the truth. She had ridden a stubborn old plow mule. Once. He gave her a look that said he knew better. "We only got one horse. Then I will walk." He let out a long sigh, the sound of a man plumb out of patience. "We ain't got time for that." He just looked at her, standing there, swallowed up in his 2 large britches, looking stubborn, but frail as a bluebell. "All right then, but you'll do as I say." He led quiet out from the lean-to. He swung up on that gray gelding, smooth as you please, then looked down at her. He reached down a hand. "Well, come on." She placed her little hand in his. His grip was firm and warm, swallowing her small hand right up. He gave a pull. She was light as a feather. He hauled her right up, swinging her sideways and settled her behind him. "You'll have to ride side saddle with Owen," he said, his voice a low rumble. She got herself situated on the horse's back, her legs dangling down one side. She had nothing at all to hold on to. The horse shifted under them. She started to slip and let out a little cry. "Wrap your arms round my middle," he ordered, his back straight as a board. "And you best not fall off." She hesitated for a moment. It felt mighty close, but it was either that or a mouthful of dirt. Slowly, a little shy, she wrapped her arms around him. His middle was solid as an oak. He was wearing his thick wool coat, but even through it, she could feel the hard-packed muscle of his back. He was like leaning against a warm stove. She pressed her cheek to his back, taking in the smell of him. Wood smoke, pine needles, horse, and that clean, sharp bite of cold air. He nudged the horse into a walk. The motion was a little rough. She clung to him, her knuckles turning white with every single step that horse took. Her body swayed against his. The contact sent a little jolt through her, a slow, burning warmth that started deep in her belly and spread outward. She was trembling, but it sure was not from the cold. They went to check the traps. He showed her how to read the signs, how to spot the faint little print of a fox in the dirt. He gave her the snared rabbits to hold, their little bodies still warm. She did not even flinch. She just watched him reset the snares, his hands moving quick and sure. They worked side by side, a quiet, steady team. The sun felt warm on her face, and for the very first time since that awful wedding day, she felt something that was almost like peace. That night, the little cabin was quiet. They sat there by the fire. He was oiling up a harness, and she was mending his shirt, the very one he had given her to wear. Her stitches were small and neat, a skill her mama had made sure she learned. She was thinking about that ride, about the feel of his body, so solid and safe there in front of her. She thought about Harlan and what he had had in mind for her. A world of difference. I'm, I'm not proper, she said, the words just tumbling out before she could stop them. He just grunted, not even looking up from his work. I'm not a proper woman, she said again, more forcefully. He stopped cold. He looked right at her, his eyes narrowing to slits in the firelight. What's that supposed to mean? She picked at a loose thread on her dress. My, my stepfather. That lie came a little easier this time. Harland, when he never did, he never kissed me. Not in a real way. I don't reckon he ever meant to. She looked up at him, her face a terrible mix of shame and confusion. No one has. Not ever. I don't think I even know how to be a wife. I don't know how to be touched. Is, is there something broken inside me? Colt went still as a stone. His hands stopped their work. The piece of oiled leather slipped from his lap and fell to the floor. He stared hard into the fire. His jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. A long, heavy silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, so quiet she could barely hear it. No. He never took his eyes off the fire. There ain't a single thing broken in you, he said, his voice fierce, his gaze still locked on the flames. Not a blessed thing. She hadn't even realized she was holding her breath, waiting for him to judge her. She let it out, and a small, broken swell came with it. She buried her face in her hands and let the silent tears fall. She cried for her father's weakness, for Harlan's pure meanness, and for the awful, aching loneliness that had been her whole life. He didn't move an inch to comfort her. He just sat there, a silent stone guardian watching over her sorrow. That night, her sleep was fitful. But she didn't dream of the running or the cold or that awful belt. Instead, she dreamed of Colt. She was on her cot. The fire burned down to glowing embers. He was standing over her, but he wasn't the same hard, quiet man from before. His eyes in the dream were soft. The gray of them warmed up like polished silver. He knelt beside the cot, and he didn't grab for her. He just held out his hand, palm up. In the dream, she took it, his calloused fingers lacing gently with hers. He leaned in. He kissed her forehead, a soft, warm press. He kissed her eyelids. He kissed the very corner of her mouth. And then, his lips met hers. It was not a forceful kiss, not demanding at all. It was a slow, gentle pressure, like he was asking a question. And in that dream, her body answered, melting, opening up, and coming alive. He began to unbutton her shirt, his knuckles brushing against the tender skin of her collarbone. And she, Evelyn, woke with a sharp, choked gasp. The cabin was pitch dark. The fire was nothing but a bed of glowing red coals, gold embers. Across the way, Colt was just a shadow on the floor, all rolled up in his blankets, his breathing deep and steady. Her own heart was pounding so hard it felt like a fist beaten against her ribs. She was slick with sweat, and underneath the blankets, a deep, liquid warmth was pulsing down low. It was a feeling she had never, ever known. It felt good, but that was swallowed by a shame so deep it turned her stomach. The next morning, she couldn't even bring herself to look at him. She was a different person. She was quiet, all right, but it was not a peaceful kind of quiet. It was a jumpy, guilty silence. She kept to the cot, with her back turned to him. She dropped the tin plate, and the clatter on the floor made her jump clean out of her skin. She burned the bread, her face flushing hot, when he just scraped the black crust off without a single word. He knew. He could feel the change in the air. The easy, comfortable silence of the past few days was gone, replaced by something tight, like a wire stretched too thin. He watched her, his face cautious. Snow's almost gone from the south ridge, he finally said, just trying to break the tension. She just nodded, scrubbing a pot with a force that was just not necessary. The day just dragged on, the air in that little cabin growing thicker with every hour. When night fell, the small room seemed to shrink, closing in on the both of them. He ate his stew standing by the fire. She ate hers over on the cot. The silence felt like an accusation. She couldn't bear it. She couldn't bear her own shame. She couldn't bear him being so distant. She just had to know. She stood up, the rough wool of the trousers scratched against her legs. He heard her move and turned from the fire, his whole body going still. She started walking toward him. She felt so small, so exposed. He was so much taller than her. He was bigger than Harlan, bigger than any man she had ever known. His size, which once felt like a comfort, now felt dangerous. She stopped, just out of his reach. Her hand was shaking. She lifted it up. She didn't have a lick of sense what she was doing. She just needed to touch him, to see if he was real, to see if she was real. Her fingers, trembling something awful, brushed the back of his hand where it rested on the rough log of the mantelpiece. His skin was hot and calloused. He flinched, pulling in a sharp breath, but he did not pull away. "You're too big," she whispered. The words just came tumbling out, all raw and unfiltered. They were the same words she had almost said to Harlan, words of pure terror. But now, well, they were not exactly words of love. They were words of pure awe, but she meant them. It was a clumsy, desperate, broken thing to say, a jumble of her old fear and this new, terrifying longing. Colt looked at her like she had slapped him clean across the face. The color drained from his face right under his beard. He was just plain stunned. He took a hard step back, putting a good foot of space between them. "Do not," he said. His voice was all choked up. "Do not say that. Just do not." He turned away from her, a sharp, jerky motion. He raked a hand through his hair, his fingers gripping the strands tight. He looked like a man caught in a trap. "You have no idea what you are saying," he bit out. "You do not know me, she." "I know you are not him," she said, her voice finding a little bit of desperate strength. "I know you are gentle." "Gentle?" He let out a laugh, but it was a bitter, broken sound. He turned to face her again, and his eyes were not soft anymore. They were full of torment. "Evelyn," he said, and him using her name, a name she had never once told him, a name he must have picked up from her fever dreams, hit her like a punch. "You do not understand. Years ago, back home in Texas, I was just a boy, 17, a stable hand, a rich man's wife. That is what she was. She liked to talk to me. I reckon she was lonely. Her husband, he found us talking. He did not like that one bit." His voice turned rough, thick with old pain. "He said I touched her. He said I forced her. He said I did things to her." He spat the words out like they were poison. "I never laid a single hand on her. I never did. But I was poor, and from the wrong side of the tracks. He was rich, and he was powerful." He started pacing then, a caged animal in that small cabin. "The judge, he called me a danger to women. He branded me. I spent 3 long years on a prison farm for a lie. 3 years of my life just gone for a lie." He stopped, his chest heaving. He looked at her, and his whole soul was laid bare in his eyes, raw and hurting. "When I got out, I swore," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I swore I would never touch a woman again. Never. Not unless she all but begged me. Not unless she made it so crystal clear. So clear that no one, no judge, not even God Almighty, could ever twist it into a lie." The silence in the cabin was so thick you could cut it with a knife, broken only by the hiss of the fire and his own ragged breathing. Evelyn looked at him, this quiet, gentle man who had saved her. This man who had been chewed up and spit out by the same cruel world that had hurt her. He had sold her. Her dream. But it was not a sin. It was the only answer. She took a step right toward him, closing the distance he had put between them. He flinched, but he held his ground. She laid her trembling hand right on his chest, over the thin wool of his shirt. She could feel his heart, just hammering away like a drum. She looked right up, meeting his pained and terrified eyes. "Then let me be the one to beg." His name, Colt, came from her lips like a question, and a prayer, and a simple fact. She had said, "Then let me be the one to beg." And those words just hung there in the heavy air, like a promise spoken into the quiet. He was frozen solid, a man caught up in his own past, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and a longing so deep it was painful to even see. His hands, those scarred and steady hands, were clenched into tight fists at his sides, like he was fighting himself not to reach for her or to push her away. "Evelyn," he whispered, and her name on his lips sounded like a man about to break. "You do not know what you are asking. I am not what you think I am. I am not a safe man." "You are the only safe place I have ever known," she answered back. Her voice was trembling, but it was fierce. She had already survived a monster's house. This man's inner turmoil did not scare her one bit. She stepped even closer, with her hands still resting on his chest. His heart was just a wild thing beating against her palm. "You said, you said you would not touch me unless I made it perfectly clear." She took his right hand, the one still clenched into a fist, and slowly, so gently, she uncurled his fingers with her own. Then she placed his open palm flat against her own cheek. The feeling of his skin on hers was like a lightning strike. He hissed, taking a sharp breath, and his whole body went stiff as a board. His skin was rough and hot, and he was shaking all over. "Is this clear enough?" she whispered. His eyes closed for just a moment. A flicker of deep, deep pain crossed his face. Or maybe it was deep relief. "Lord, help me," he breathed out. He did not kiss her. He did not pull her close. He just stood there, letting her hold his hand right there against her face, like a statue learning how to feel all over again. She led him, one step at a time, from the warmth of the fire over to the cot. It was the most frightening and powerful walk of her entire life. She was the one leading the way now. She was the one who spoke, pulling him down to sit right beside her on that narrow, creaking mattress. "They were all lies," she said, her voice soft and low. "Everything they said about you." "It was a lie. I know it was." He looked at her then, and the dam inside of him control. The wall he had built for years just came tumbling down. A single tear broke free, cutting a clean path through the dirt on his cheek. And he just let it be. She leaned in, slow as a Texas sunrise, and her lips found that wet track on his skin. It tasted of salt, of soot, and old heartaches. A deep shudder ran through him, a tremor that shook him to his core. And his hand, the one on her cheek, finally stirred. His fingers wove into her hair, his touch so light you could barely feel it, as if he were holding a butterfly he was scared to break. "Evelyn," he said again, his voice all cracked and broken. "Show me," she whispered against his skin. "Please, Colt, show me what this is. Not, not what that man wanted." He gently guided her back onto the scratchy wool blankets. He stayed over her, his weight on his elbows, his whole body like a shield against the cold, against the whole world, against everything but him. He was so big he blocked out the firelight, and she was wrapped up in his shadow, in his smell of pine and campfire smoke. "If I hurt you," he choked out, his voice just raw with feeling. If you feel scared, you tell me. You holler. You hit me. You understand me?" "I am not afraid of you, Colt," she said, her voice steady and clear. He looked deep into her eyes, a long, searching gaze, and then he lowered his head. His first kiss was not on her lips. It was right on her forehead, a long, firm, respectful kiss that felt like a prayer. He kissed her eyelids, her temple, the soft line of her jaw. It was like he was mapping her face, learning her in the dark. When his lips finally met hers, it was hesitant, just a soft brush, like he was asking a question. She answered by opening her lips, a small, shy invitation. And the kiss grew deeper, and it was nothing like her dream. This was real. It was a little clumsy, a little wet, and desperate, and so tender it ached. It was the first real thing that had ever happened in her whole life. He moved slow, his hands learning the shape of her body through the rough wool of his shirt. He paused at every single button, his eyes asking for permission. She just nodded, her throat feeling tight. He stopped the moment his hand brushed the bare skin of her collarbone, his fingers trembling. Wait, he said, pulling back, his breath all ragged. This is, this is your last chance to say no. My only chance, she whispered back, is to say yes. What happened next was like a coming apart. It was a rush of feeling, powerful and all-consuming. It was raw, not some simple duty like her mother had suggested, and not the cruel business Harlan had threatened with that coiled belt of his. This was from the heart. It was like chasing out a bad spirit. He was clumsy, almost scared of his own strength, his past like a ghost standing right there in the room. He stopped again and again, his whole body trembling from holding himself back. Am I hurting you? Is this all right? She started crying, not in some quiet, polite way, but with big, gulping sobs that just tore right out of her. He flinched back, pulling away in an instant, his face a picture of pure panic and self-blame. I hurt you. I am so sorry. Lord, I am sorry. No, she cried, grabbing his arms, his strong, ropey arms. No, Colt. No. She was sobbing so hard she could hardly get the words out, but she pulled him back, her fingers digging into his skin. It is not. It is not pain. It is, it is relief. It is, I am empty. You are, you are filling me up. Oh goodness, Colt. It was the relief you feel when a wound is finally washed clean. It was the release of 18 years of fear, of shame, of being treated like a piece of property, of being small and silent and without any power. In his arms, in his terrifying but gentle care, she was being put back together. She was being made whole again. He looked at her, saw the honest truth in her tear-streaked eyes when the last of his own fear just broke. He held her, kissing her hair, her face, her shoulders, whispering her name over and over like a prayer, and their bodies finally found a pace, a desperate, healing pace in the deep, cold quiet of that mountain cabin. In the days that followed, the cabin changed. The air, which had been thick with unspoken worries, was now light. It was filled with a new, delicate closeness. Evelyn woke the next morning tangled up in his arms, his heavy blanket thrown over the both of them. He was already awake, just watching her, his gray eyes clear and quiet. A dark, slow blush crept up his neck when he saw she was looking at him. He did not pull away. She smiled, a small, uncertain smile. And then she laughed. It was a strange, rusty sound, like a piece of machinery that had not been used in a long time. She laughed at how unbelievable it all was. Here she was, a runaway bride snowed in with a branded outcast, and she had never in her life felt so safe. The corners of his own lips twitched. What is so funny? I do not know, she said, and her laugh grew, a bubble of pure, simple joy. Joy. I don't know a thing. So he began to teach her. The world out there was still a mighty dangerous place, and he knew he could not keep her cooped up in this cabin forever. He needed her to be strong, not just in spirit, but with her own two hands. You need to know how to handle this, he said one bright, cold afternoon, placing his rifle into her hands. It was heavy, all right. She staggered a bit under the weight of that oiled steel and dark wood. I have never even held a gun. He gave a little chuckle. I know, he said. He stood right behind her, his chest a solid, warm wall against her back. He put his arms around her, his hands covering hers, showing her how to hold it steady, how to brace the stock firm against her shoulder. Do not be afraid of it. It is just a tool like a hammer or a knife. You just have to respect it, he said, pointing to a tin can on a distant stump. Now line up the sight, breathe out slow, and squeeze. Do not go pulling it. She flinched at the loud bang, the kick, and the roar of it, but that can went flying right off the stump. A clean hit. She turned around, her eyes wide with shock and a new fierce pride. He was watching her, not the can. Good, Pam, he said, his voice real soft. You are a natural. He taught her how to clean the rabbits from his snares that first time. She had to turn away, her stomach doing flip-flops. He did not coddle her, though. He just kept right on, his hands moving with a quick, practical skill, talking her through every step. Waste nothing. The wilderness does not forgive waste. The very next day, she did it all by herself. Her hands were shaking, her teeth clenched. But she got it done. She was a preacher's daughter who now knew how to skin her own supper. He taught her how to read the skinuam. See those clouds, he would say, his arm pointing up, his hand just barely brushing her shoulder. They look like a mare's tail. A wind is coming, a hard wind. He taught her to read the snow, to see the tracks of the fox, the deer, and the bear. He was giving her his world, one piece at a time. Their bond was built in all those small moments. It was in the shared cup of coffee, in the cold, dark quiet before the sun came up. It was in the way he would pass her the last piece of bread, and the way she would break it, giving him the bigger half. It was in those quiet looks they would steal at each other. She would watch his hands as he carved a piece of wood into a spoon. He would watch her as she brushed her hair by the fire, the long, dark strands crackling in the dry air. It was in the sudden, quiet kisses. He would be leaving to check the traps. Then he would pause, his hand on her cheek, and press his lips to her temple. She grew bold. One afternoon, as he was grumbling over a torn harness, she walked right up to him, grabbed his shirt, pulled him down, and kissed him hard. He froze solid, completely stunned. Then his arms wrapped tight around her, lifting her clean off the floor, his kiss answering hers with a fierce hunger that left her breathless. He even started to tease her. He had this dry, quiet wit that he usually kept hidden. She dropped a tin plate, and it clattered across the floorboards. "You trying to scare off every bear on the mountain?" he had grumbled. "I was just testing the floor," she shot back, and his rare, quiet laugh was her reward. But underneath the laughter, that fear was always there. The cabin was a warm little bubble, but the world outside was still cold, and it was still waiting. Every time the wind howled, she would jump, her eyes flying straight to the door. And he, in turn, slept with one eye open, his rifle never more than an arm's reach away. They both knew they could not hide out there forever. The spring thaw came on faster than he had expected. The south-facing slopes were already bare, and the pass, while still treacherous, was no longer impassable. One afternoon, Colt rode out with his rifle in hand. "Honey," he had said, "we need meat. The snares are empty. The deer are moving down low." She watched him go, a tight knot of fear forming in her stomach. He had been gone for hours, much longer than usual. The sun was starting to dip low, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of orange and deep blood red. When she finally saw him, he was riding hard, and the horse was covered in sweat. He did not stop at the lean-to. He rode straight to the cabin, swinging down before the horse had even fully stopped. He burst through the door, and he was not the same man who had left that morning. The gentle teacher, the tender lover, was gone. In his place was the man who had been branded, the outcast, the survivor. His eyes were hard as stone, and his face was a mask of cold fury. "What is it?" she asked, her hands flying to her throat. "Pack," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He was already moving, grabbing his bedroll, checking his ammunition. "Colt, you are frightening me. What happened?" He stopped. He looked right at her. "I went down low toward the valley. There were men, 3 of them, at the old miners' camp. They were riders asking questions, asking about some woman, a girl really, who ran from her wedding still wearing her white dress." Evelyn felt all the blood just drain from her face. She stumbled backward, grabbing the table to hold herself up. They know you came this way. They found a scrap of lace from your dress. They are offering a reward. Harlan Riggs is offering a reward for his stepdaughter." He nearly spat the word out. He looked right at her, his eyes narrowing. The truth of her lie was suddenly hanging sharp and heavy between them. Her story just crumbled. She could not keep it up, not now. He deserved the truth. He deserved to know what he was risking. "He is not my stepfather," she whispered, her voice shaking so hard she could barely form the words. Colt stopped right there, his hands full of cartridges. He did not look surprised. He just looked bone-tired. "No," he said. "I did not figure he was. That was my wedding day, Colt. That ceremony, it was real. My father, he had debts, gambling debts. He sold me to Harlan. Harlan Riggs is my legal husband." The confession just hung in the air, ugly and sharp for a long moment. Colt did not move. He just stared at her, the full, devastating weight of her words settling down on him. Then, with a low growl like a cornered animal, he swept his arm across the table. The tin plates, the coffee pot, the little spoon she had carved, all of it went crashing down to the floor. He did not rage at her. He raged at the whole dang world. He hit the wall, the solid wall with his fist. The sound was a dull, sickening thud. Husband, he bit out. The words ripped right from his throat. A legal husband. He turned to her, his eyes blazing, not with anger at her, but with a terrible, protective fury. Do you know what this means, Evelyn? Do you? You are his property. That is what the law says. You are a piece of property, like his horse or his house. He paced the small cabin like a caged lion. They are not going to call what I did a rescue. They will not call this a sanctuary. They are going to call it kidnapping. They will call it, worse, they will call it stealing another man's wife. They will hang me, Evelyn. They will hang me, and then they will give you right back to him. She was crying now. The tears she had held back were finally coming. I am so sorry, she sobbed. I should have told you. I will go. I will turn myself in. I will not, I will not let them hurt you. He crossed the room in a single long stride. He grabbed her by the shoulders. His grip was firm, almost bruising, but it was not mean. It was pure desperation. You will not do that, he growled low. You hear me? You don't belong to him, and you sure don't belong to your father. You are not going back to him. But they'll kill you. Let him try, he said, his voice a low, deadly promise. I'd see him into the ground before I let him lay a hand on you again. I'd take 'em all down. He let her go then, his hands softening, his thumbs rubbing her shoulders. You could see the wheels turning in his head. We run, he said, his voice flat and sure. Run where, she asked. North, he answered, up to the territories. It's wild country up there. The law is stretched mighty thin. A man can disappear. A woman can start over. I hear tell there are traveling preachers. Men who will grant an annulment for the right price if we can find one. It's a chance, and it's the only one we've got. Then he pulled her in close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her so tight she could hardly catch her breath. We leave tonight, before they get on our trail. That night, the little cabin felt different. It was not a safe haven anymore. It felt more like a tomb they had to escape. The fear of what was coming was so thick you could feel it, like a third person in the room with them. It was a cold, sharp feeling. They packed in silence. Food, bullets, the blankets, his knife. There was no talking, just the sound of them moving quickly, and the heavy knowledge that just a few miles down that mountain, men were hunting for her. When they were all packed, he looked at her. Her face was pale in the firelight, and her eyes were wide with fear. But she was not broken. She was holding steady. He reached for her then, his hand gently cupping her jaw. The future was a dark, cold unknown. They might not survive this run. They could be caught by sunup. This right here, this might be the last bit of peace they would ever know. He did not say a word. He did not have to. She came to him, her body asking a silent question. This time, it was not like the gentle discovery of their first night together. It was not like the soft, easy way they had been these past few weeks. This was desperate. It was raw, and it was a claiming. They came together with a force that felt almost like a fight, a deep, primal need to prove that this connection, this life they had, was real, before the world tried to rip it away from them. It was a battle, and it was a prayer. They were holding on to each other with a desperate, fearful need, a need that burned right through them. Later, as they lay all wrapped up in the blankets, the fire had burned low, down to just glowing embers. Listening to that wind howl outside, she whispered into the dark, her lips resting on his chest. I never knew, she whispered, her voice barely there, full of wonder. I never knew love could feel like just staying alive. But that cabin was a cold, empty shell in the gray light of dawn. The fire was out. The embers were nothing but gray dust. They moved around that small space, grim and quiet, getting things done. Their short life together was packed into 2 bedrolls and a single saddlebag. Colt was a different man now. The gentleness of the night was gone, replaced by a hard, watchful eye. He was a hunter again, only this time, they were the ones being hunted. He threw snow on the last of the fire, not for safety, but to wipe away any sign of their being there. "Stay off the main path," he said, his voice low and serious. "Step where I step. Do not break a single branch. Do not leave a trace." He led her out of there, not through the easy pass, but straight up a high, dangerous ridge, a place where nobody in their right mind would expect them to go. The snow was still deep, but it had a crust on it, slick as ice. The melt had frozen hard overnight. He moved with a speed and a quietness she found hard to keep up with. But she did it. Evelyn did not complain one bit. She did not stumble. Her fear was a cold, hard rock in her gut, but she used it. She placed her bandaged feet right where his boots had been. She held tight to the rifle he had given her. Its weight felt strange, but solid and comforting, especially when he offered a hand to help her over a steep patch of ice. Her grip was strong. He looked at her, giving her a quick, sizing-up glance. He saw the firm set of her jaw, the grit in her eyes. The scared girl he had found was gone. In her place, he saw a woman. He nodded, just a small, quick sign that he was impressed. And they kept on moving. They traveled for 3 long days, heading north, staying clear of the trails, eating cold hardtack and dried meat right out of his pack. They barely spoke. Every single sound was a threat. Every crack of a branch in the distance made them freeze solid. Colt was reading the land like a book. His eyes were always scanning, searching for the telltale signs of riders, or for a wisp of smoke from a campfire. On the 3rd evening, they finally came over a ridge and looked down into a small, miserable-looking hollow. It was not a town. It was a lonely outpost, just a collection of 3 sod-roofed cabins in a ramshackle building that called itself a trading post, all huddled around a muddy, stinking spring. A crooked sign hanging by one hinge just said "Gentry's." "We're stopping here," Colt said, easing quiet into a small patch of bony-looking aspens. "Whoa now, hold up. They'll spot us for sure. We need a piece of paper more than we need a hot meal." He turned to her, his face set like stone. "A well-told lie on paper is the only thing that's going to get us through this. A traveling notary stops here, 3rd week of the month, sells fake documents, land claims, even cattle brands. I heard the talk, either our luck's in or it's run clean out." He left her with the horse, gripping his rifle tight, and just melted into the long shadows of that outpost. Evelyn waited, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. Every holler, every loud laugh from that place sent a fresh wave of fear right through her. She held onto the rifle, her shoulder throbbing with a deep ache from where she'd fired it. And Lord, she prayed. He came back about an hour later. The look on his face told her everything. "He's in there, a man named Silas Croft. He's half drunk and twice as greedy. His price? 50 gold pieces." Evelyn felt the blood drain right out of her face. "We don't have that. We have almost nothing." "I've got my pelts," Colt said quietly. He had a small prize bundle in his pack. Prime beaver and fox he'd been saving for a real good trade. "It ain't nearly enough. He wants the horse." "Quiet," she whispered, breathing the name. To give up the horse was to give up their only way to run, their only chance. "He wants our horse," Colt repeated, his jaw clenched tight. "I told him no deal, so he said 40 gold and the rifle." Evelyn's eyes went down to the rifle in her hands, the very tool he had taught her to use, their one and only true defense. "He can smell how desperate we are," Colt said, his voice flat and empty. "No," Evelyn said. She got to her feet, and her mind was suddenly, terribly clear. "He doesn't really want the rifle. He's just a man. He wants to feel powerful. Give me the pelts and the $30 you have." "Evelyn, absolutely not. You are not walking in there. You're a threat to a man like that." She got her voice coming out surprisingly steady. "You're a man holding a gun, and you look like you know how to use it. He thinks he can bleed you dry. But me, I'm just a woman who looks like she needs some help." She took the money and the bundle of pelts. She walked out of the trees, across that muddy ground, and straight toward the trading post. Her legs were shaking, but she didn't stumble once. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the sour smell of whiskey and men who hadn't seen soap and water in weeks. The talking stopped when she entered, their eyes crawling all over her, taking in her men's trousers and the torn wool shirt. She paid them no mind at all. Them. She found him soon enough, a small, rat-like man in a dirty suit, sitting at a corner table with a bottle and a pile of papers. She walked right up to his table. "Mr. Croft?" He looked up. His eyes were blurry, but had a sharp glint to them. "What do you want, girl?" She put the pelts down on the table. Then she placed the $30, 2 gold coins, and a stack of silver right on top of them. "I need a paper," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not begging, but just stating a fact. I need a document, notarized and stamped, saying I was never married, saying my name is Evelyn Hayes from Missouri, and that I'm of legal age and free to travel." He eyed the money. He eyed the pelts. Then he eyed her. "This is $30. I told that big fella 50. That big fella was mistaken," Evelyn said, her voice getting even lower. "He was angry. I am not. This is a gift for your trouble. My stepfather, he's a cruel man. He's hunting me down. I need to get up north to my aunt in the territories. This paper here will keep me safe on the road." She used her lie, the very same one she'd first told Colt, and it felt like a weapon in her hand. Croft smiled. It was a slow, ugly showing of yellow teeth. "A cruel stepfather. Yes, I've written many papers like that, but $50 is the going rate for that kind of cruelty." Evelyn leaned closer. She wasn't smiling at all. "And I am telling you, sir, that this is all the money we have, and that if you don't help me, my protector, who is waiting outside and who is a very jealous man, is going to be mighty displeased. He is not a man you want to make unhappy. He was branded down in Texas on account of his temper." She used Colt's own pain, his past, and she hated herself for doing it. But she saw that flicker of fear in Croft's eyes. A branded man, a dangerous man. Croft looked back at the money. He looked at the door. Then he looked at her. He licked his lips. "It's a mighty difficult forgery. The county seal. Awful complex. I am sure you are a master of your craft," she whispered. He let out a sigh. He swept the money and the pelts right into his bag. "Come back in 1 hour and tell your protector to stay clear of my business." They rode out of Gentry an hour later. Evelyn held the reins with Colt riding quiet behind her. They had the paper, a crisp, official-looking lie, tucked right inside Colt's shirt, warm against his skin. He hadn't said a single word about what she had done, but as he'd swung up on the horse behind her, his hand had rested there on her waist, for just a moment longer than it needed to. They rode on for 2 more days. They kept pushing north, where the land got wilder and flatter, the mountains just fading away into high plains and cold, dark lakes. One night they made camp on the shore of one of them. The water was black and still as a mirror, and the sky held so many stars it looked like you could walk on it. They had been mighty lucky, had not seen hide nor hair of any riders. That forged paper felt like a shield in his pocket. They sat by their small, smokeless fire, and the quiet between them was heavy, but it was not a tense quiet anymore. It was the kind of silence that settles between two folks who have passed through the fire together and come out the other side. Evelyn was the first to speak. She was just staring into the flames, her face all shadows. "My father," she said, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear. "He was not born a bad man. Not in the beginning. He was just weak. He loved the cards. He loved the feel of them in his hands more than he ever loved the word of God. More than he loved my own mother, and Lord help me, more than he ever loved me." Colt just sat there listening. "It started small," she said. $1 here, $5 was there. Then he lost our mule. Then he signed a paper putting up a mortgage on the church itself to one of Harlan's outfits. He was so sure he could win it back. He was always so sure. She picked up a little twig and poked it into the red-hot embers, just watching it glow. "The night before I was to be married, I heard them. Harlan was in our parlor, and he was not yelling. His voice was quiet, like a snake. He said, "Preacher, your tab is due. I own this house, I own your church, and I own you." And my father just broke down and cried. He begged him. And Harlan, he just laughed. He said, "There is one other thing you own, one last thing of value, her innocence." She, tears started tracing silent paths down her cheeks, catching the light from the fire. He did not just sell me to clear his debt, Colt. He sold me to save his own hide. He sold me, his own daughter and her innocence, just so he could keep his house. The very next day, he walked me down to that church and he just handed me over. She was really crying now, the little stick forgotten, her hands flying up to cover her face. She made this low, wounded sound, the kind of sound a soul makes when it has been betrayed, a childhood just shattered to pieces. Colt moved then, shifting from his side of the fire over to hers. He did not touch her, not right away. He just sat there next to her, his presence like a solid, warm wall against the dark. He waited until her crying quieted down some. Then he handed her his neckerchief. It was rough cotton, and it smelled of dust and him. She wiped her face. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "Do not you be," he said, his voice all gravel, and he looked out into the night, across the dark water of that lake. "You reckon you're the only one with a past that bites?" He went quiet for a good long while. Evelyn figured he was finished talking. "The prison farm," he said, his voice as flat as a West Texas highway. "It was not the hard labor that got to you. It was the emptiness, just gray, day in and day out, always the same, the guards, the awful things they did, and the things they just stood by and let happen. After a while, you stop feeling like a man. You are just a creature, a number. You forget what the sun even feels like when it is beaten down on your skin." He picked up a rock, just rolling it over and over in his scarred hands. "I finally got out. After 3 long years, I just walked for a solid week. I had nothing to my name. No money, no pride, nothing. I was just the monster they all said I was, a danger to everyone." He paused, his hands squeezing that rock so tight his knuckles turned bone white. "I ended up at a river running wide and fast. It was the spring melt. I just sat there on the bank all day long. And I thought, what is the point? I am branded for life. I will never be right again. I will never be nothing. It would have been so easy to just give up, to let that cold water wash it all away. Every last bit of it." Evelyn forgot to breathe. She just stared at the hard line of his jaw against the starry sky. "I walked right into that water," he whispered. "It was so cold it burned, but it felt good, like it was scouring all the filth off me. I took one step, then another, and then I was ready. I just let go." A tiny, heartbroken sound escaped her lips, and her hand found his, the one that was not clutching that rock. She wove her fingers through his. He slowly turned his head, and his eyes, dark in the shadows, found hers. "I still do not know why I fought it. I really do not. Something deep inside me just would not quit. I grabbed onto a root. I dragged myself out. I just laid there on that muddy bank for a whole day and night, just shaken. And right then, I swore an oath. I would never get close to people again. I would never again give anyone the power to make me want to quit living. I came out west to be left alone. I figured I would find some peace or I would find my end. It did not much matter to me which one found me first." They just looked at each other, two broken, lost souls in the deep dark of the night. She could not tell you who moved first. Next thing she knew, they were just together. She was in his lap, her face buried in his neck, and he was holding her tight, his arms wrapped around her like he was the one going under, and she was the only thing keeping his head above water. They cried. They cried for her father's failings and for his own. They cried for all the years he lost and the innocence she never had. They cried for the cruelty of men like Harland and the weakness of men like her father. It was a silent, shared, shoulder-shaking grief, a purging of all the poison they had held inside. That night they did not make love. They rolled their 2 bedrolls into one. He held her, his front to her back, his arm draped over her waist, his hand resting on her stomach. She held his hand, her fingers laced with his. They just held each other. The silence in the tent was heavier, more sacred than any words, any vows, any prayer. It was the silence of two people who had shown each other their deepest, ugliest scars and had not looked away. They were on the trail for another 4 days. The land was changing. They were in the open, a rolling high plains that offered no cover. The shared confessions by the lake had forged a new bond. They were a single unit. They moved as one. The ambush came on a bright, cold morning. They were riding through a shallow arroyo, the banks high on either side. It was a trap. Colt knew it a second before it happened. He reined in, quiet, his hand flying to his rifle. "Get down," he hissed. A shot cracked the silence. A bullet chipped the rock just above Evelyn's head. "Harlan Riggs sends his regards." A voice boomed from the ridge. 3 men, 2 on the ridge above, 1 blocking the arroyo ahead. Harlan's men stay with the horse. Colt roared. He slid from the saddle, his rifle in his hand. He was not a man. He was a force. He was the branded outcast, the cornered wolf. He fired 1, 2, 3 times, pinning the men on the ridge. The man in the pass spurred his horse. Charging, Colt met him. He didn't have time to reload. He used the rifle as a club. A brutal swinging blow that knocked the man from his saddle. The man landed, rolled, and came up with a knife. Colt dropped his rifle and pulled his own. It was not a fight. It was a butchering. It was bloody. It was brutal. Colt moved with a speed and a violence that terrified Evelyn. He was not the gentleman who held her. He was the man who had survived a prison farm. He lunged, a flurry of steel, and the fight was over in a second. The man on the ground did not get up. A shot rang out from the ridge. Colt cried out, a sharp pain sound. He stumbled, grabbing his shoulder. The 2 men up on that ridge, those fellows were taking aim, looking mighty sure of themselves. All they saw was a wounded man, 1 horse, and a woman. Evelyn's eyes took it all in. She saw Colt stagger. She saw the dark stains spreading. She saw those men up there, cool as you please, reloading their rifles and laughing about it. And in that moment, the preacher's daughter vanished. In her place was a woman who grabbed the second rifle, the one that belonged to the man Colt had put down. His words echoed in her head. "Brace the stock firm against your shoulder. Breathe out slow. Squeeze the trigger." But she did not aim for the men. No, she aimed for the big rock right beside them. The rifle exploded in her hands, and the kick was a mean, painful shove. Her shot went wild, but Lord, it was loud. It ricocheted, screaming off that rock wall, and showered those men with little chips of stone. They hollered and ducked for cover, completely confused. A woman was shooting at them. "Get on the horse!" Colt roared, clutching his arm while blood streamed right through his fingers. He scrambled for his own rifle and fired another shot at the ridge, making those fellas scatter like quail. Then he grabbed the reins of quiet, threw himself up into the saddle, and reached down. He reached down for Evelyn. With a grunt, he hauled her up in front of him and spurred the horse onward. They galloped hard down that dry creek bed, right past the fallen man, as 2 more bullets kicked up dust behind them. They just kept riding. They rode for a solid hour. They rode until poor old Quiet was stumbling. The horse's coat was thick with foam. They rode until that whole ugly scene was just a distant memory. By then, Colt was swaying in the saddle, his full weight leaning heavy against her back. "Stop," he gasped out. "Right here, in the pines." He tried to slide off the horse, but he did not land on his feet. He just collapsed in a heap. He tried to get up, but fell right back down. "Colt!" she screamed out. She was off that horse in a heartbeat and right there at his side. The whole left side of his shirt was soaked dark with blood. They're still coming," he panted, his face pale as a ghost and slick with sweat. "Evelyn, you have to run. Take the horse, take that paper and head north. Whatever you do, do not let them find you. You just hush now," she said, her voice shaking but as fierce as a cornered cat. "You are not dying on me out here." She tore his shirt right open. The wound was high on his shoulder, a nasty torn-up mess. The bullet was still lodged in there. She scrambled over to the saddlebags looking for his kit. Inside was a small flask of whiskey, a needle, and a spool of thick thread. She knelt back down beside him. She pulled the cork from the whiskey bottle. Bite down on this, she said, stuffing his neckerchief into his mouth, and take a drink. Then she poured half of what was left right over the wound. He let out a muffled roar of pure agony. Good, she whispered, her own hands shaking but steady, her hands shaken so hard she could barely thread the needle. Now you stay awake. You are not leaving me. I will not be alone again. Do you hear me? She poured the last of that whiskey over the needle and began to stitch him back together. It was a rough, terrible job, her stitches all big and uneven. He was a living man, and she was sewing his flesh. He writhed, his body bucking, his eyes wide with a pain she could hardly stand to look at. I'm sorry, she whispered, her own tears blinding her. I'm so sorry. Just hold on. You just hold on. When she was done, she wrapped him up in strips she tore from her own shirt. He was limp, his breath coming in shallow puffs. The fever was already taking hold. He looked at her, his eyes glassy and lost. So stupid, he slurred out. You should have just left me. I am not worthy. I am branded. I am nothing but trouble. He was lost in the fever, his deepest fears just spilling out. She leaned down, bringing her face right close to his, her bloody hands cupping his cheeks. You are not trouble, she whispered, and her voice was fierce. You are my savior. You are my home. She kissed him, a hard, desperate kiss that said he was hers. She kissed his sweat-soaked forehead, his pale lips. You say you are not worthy, she whispered, her lips right against his. Then I will carry the worth for us both. I will carry it until you believe it yourself. The horse was half dead on its feet. Colt was worse. He was slumped forward, tied onto the saddle, a dead weight that Evelyn had to heave upright every time he started to slip. She was walking, leading that horse through a barren, high-country plain. Her own feet were raw, her body feeling hollowed out from exhaustion. The men who chased them were gone, but they were not safe, not by a long shot. Colt was burning up with fever. The stitches she had put in his shoulder were angry and weeping. He was dying, and she was walking him toward his own grave. She did not know how long they had been walking. 2 days, maybe it was 3. Time was just a blur of dust, wind, and Colt's low, delirious moans. On the 3rd day, she saw it. It was not a town. It was a small gathering of buildings in a shallow green valley. They were not rough log cabins, but solid framed houses painted clean and white. There were barns, and they were painted red. The fences were all mended. The whole place had an air of peace and good order. She stumbled toward it, half dragging the horse along. A man came out to meet her. He was tall, dressed in simple gray clothes with a broad-brimmed hat. He was not carrying a gun, and his face, etched with time, was mighty calm. Please, Evelyn gasped, the first real word she had managed all day. He is hurt. He was shot. I reckon he is dying. The man looked at the bleeding, unconscious fellow in the saddle. Then he looked at the worn-out, blood-streaked woman clutching the reins. He did not ask who they were or why they were there. He just gave a simple nod, his face kind. Y'all best bring him on inside. We have a place. Ruth will see to him. The man, who they would soon come to know as Obadiah, helped her ease Colt down from the horse. Another man came over, silent and efficient, and took quiet, leading him to a barn with a gentle hand. They had stumbled into a Quaker settlement, a pocket of peace in the middle of a brutal, unforgiving land. Colt was laid in a clean, soft bed, a real-deal bed with linens that smelled of lye soap and fresh sunshine. A woman named Ruth, Obadiah's wife, came in with a basin of hot water, carbolic, and clean bandages. She was a small woman with a stern-looking face, but her hands were as gentle as could be. She clucked her tongue as she cut away Evelyn's crude, bloody stitches. Thee has a strong hand, child, she said, her voice surprisingly soft, but a heavy one. He is quite fortunate you stopped the bleeding. They had saved his life. Evelyn, her duty done, her last bit of adrenaline now gone, just sank right down to the floor, put her head on her knees, and fell into a sleep so deep it was almost like a small passing. They stayed for 1 week. It was a strange, quiet time. Colt drifted in and out of a deep, healing fever. Evelyn was given a small, clean room, a simple gray dress, and a place helping out in the community kitchens. She worked because she had to. The stillness, the peace of it all was unsettling. She kneaded bread with the quiet, plain-dressed women. She scrubbed the floors. She mended linens. Those simple, repeating household tasks were a balm for her soul. They grounded her there. No one ever shouted. No one made demands. The women spoke in thee and thou. Their voices were low, their movements steady. They did not ask her a thing about her past or the torn, bloodied pants she had arrived in. They simply made a space for her. Colt, when his fever finally broke, was weak as a kitten, but his eyes were clear as day. The very first thing he saw was Evelyn, asleep in a chair right by his bed. He reached out with a shaky hand and gently touched her hair. She woke up in an instant. Colt. You stayed, he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. No, I'm saving you, she whispered right back, her fingers weaving into his. As his strength came back, Colt couldn't just lay around. He was a man built for hard work. His shoulder was still wrapped up tight, but he was back on his feet. Obadiah found him down in the barn, just standing there looking at the horses. You know your way around a horse? Obadiah asked. Colt just nodded. He wasn't a man who wasted words. And these good folks, he found, didn't ask for any. They put him in charge of the stables. He started mending harnesses, his one good hand moving quick and sure. He brushed down the mares, his touch was gentle, and his voice was a low, soothing rumble that calmed them right down. He, the man with the brand, the outcast, the one they called a killer, the man who'd survived a hellish prison farm, found a strange, almost unwelcome peace in this quiet little valley. But the world outside hadn't forgotten about him. The bad news rolled in with a supply wagon coming up from the south. Evelyn was in the kitchen shelling peas when she overheard the driver talking to Obadiah. They got posters plastered all over the territory, the driver said. A warrant out for some branded fellow by the name of Colt. Seems he ran off with the new wife of Harlan Riggs. Snatched her right out of her wedding bed, they see. Riggs is offering $500 in gold for the man's head and the return of his property. The wooden bowl of peas slipped right from Evelyn's hands, scattering all across the clean, scrubbed floor. She took off running. She ran straight to the barn, her heart feeling like a cold, hard rock in her chest. Colt was in there, in the dim light, grooming the gray mare. They're coming, she said, all out of breath. There's a warrant, $500, for you and for me. He's calling me his property. The brush in his hand stopped moving. Colt's back went stiff as a board. He turned around real slow. The peace of the last week was gone. Just like that. His eyes were hard again. He was the man from the arroyo, the hunted man. I knew it, he said, his voice flat and empty. That night he came to her little room. He didn't touch her. He just stood by the door, a tall shadow in the moonlight. Evelyn, he said, his voice all rough, I'm leaving tonight. Leaving? You mean we're leaving? She said, already moving to grab her boots. No, he said, so flat it stopped her cold. Just me. I am going to turn myself in. She stared at him, unable to understand. What? No, listen to me, he said, his voice suddenly urgent and full of that old pain. I brought this down on you. I am what they say I am. I am trouble. I am a branded man. They will always hunt me. But you can be safe. If I turn myself in, they'll have the man they want. And you can be free. Tell them I made you do it. Tell them I was rough with you. They'll believe that story. They want to believe it. Riggs will take you back, but at least you'll be drawing breath. You will be safe. He was offering up his own life, putting his neck on the line for her. Or he was ready to give her the very life she had just run from. She crossed that little room in 2 long strides, and she slapped him. Her hand, calloused and hard from real work, cracked right across his face. He did not even flinch. He just looked right at her, his eyes full of a terrible, broken surrender. You fool, she whispered, her voice trembling with a rage that went deeper than any fear. You stupid, noble fool, don't you know anything? Do you really think I am safer with him? Do you think my life is worth saving if I have to live it with him? The belt, Colt, the manacles, is that what you are saving me for? She was crying now, hot, angry tears. I will not let you. I will not let you die for me, and I am not going back. Then what? He cried out, his own composure finally breaking. If we run, they will find us. They will hang me and they will drag you right back here. There is no way out for folks like us. No, she said, grabbing the front of his shirt. No more running. We fight, but not with guns. We fight with the law. We use their own rules against them. She did not rightly know what she was saying, but the words felt true in her soul. She would not be property. She went to Obadiah and Ruth, and she told them everything. Not the made-up story about her stepfather, but the full, ugly, brutal truth, the gambling debt, the sale, the awful words, her virtue for my house, the belt, the window, the escape. The two Quakers listened, their faces as still as water in a pail. They were abolitionists. They had run stations on the Underground Railroad. They knew the ugly language of slavery. You are not his property. Child, Ruth said, her voice like solid iron. No human is property, but the law of men is a dark and tangled thing. Is there no law for me? Evelyn pleaded. Is there no law for women? The law is written by men like Harlan Riggs, Obadiah said grimly. But there are always loopholes. You say the marriage was not completed? Evelyn blushed, a hot wave of shame washing over her. No, I ran before he could, Ruth said, nodding slowly. A marriage requires consent. Being sold like livestock is not consent. And there is the matter of the circuit judge. Hope, a thin, sharp needle, pierced right through Evelyn's fear. A judge? Judge Ellis Thorne, Obadiah said. He rides the circuit. He is a tough man, but a fair one. He has a lot of respect for our people. He is due in town by the end of the week. I reckon he is your only real hope. You will have to plead your case to him. Judge Thorne rode in 4 days later with 2 armed territorial marshals at his side. He was a tall fella, bearded, with eyes that looked like they saw everything. He was there to settle some land arguments and sentence a horse thief. Obadiah asked to speak with him privately. He brought Evelyn with him. Colt was told to wait out in the barn, a silent, grim prisoner of his own hope, while they met in Obadiah's simple parlor. Evelyn told her story all over again. She told it to the judge, her voice trembling, but her words were clear as day. She told him about the debt, the terrible belt, and her escape. She told him about Colt finding her, and then, with her face burning red, she even showed him that forged paper. I was so terrified, sir. I had this made. I just wanted to be free. Judge Thorne looked down at the paper. He looked up at her. Then he looked over at Obadiah. Obadiah, you are vouching for this woman. I vouch for her honesty, Judge, and I vouch for that man, Colt. He has been here for 2 weeks. He is a hard worker, not some wild man. He is gentle with the animals. He is a good man, despite that wound he carries. The judge sighed, pressing his fingertips together. This is a real predicament. A warrant is a warrant. Harlan Riggs is a powerful man, and he has a legal marriage certificate. I have seen it with my own eyes. I cannot, and I will not, simply ignore the law. Then let me speak, Evelyn said, her voice rising in public. Let Harlan face me. Let him hear my truth in front of everyone. The judge looked at her, surprised. This was not some weeping, hysterical victim. This woman was a fighter. He thought about it. It was highly unusual, but this whole situation was unusual. Very well, child, he said, a grim little smile on his face. Of public testimony, I will hear it, but I am warning you. If I find that you or your protector have lied to me in any way, I will honor that warrant, I will see him hang, and I will return you to your legal husband myself. Do you understand? I understand, Evelyn said, her back as straight as a board. I will testify. The meeting hall was packed to the rafters. Word had spread like wildfire. This was much better than a horse thief trial. This was a spectacle. The hall was hot and dusty, the air thick with the smell of sweat, tobacco, and anticipation. The Quakers in their plain, neat clothes sat on one side. Hard-bitten ranchers, trappers, and townsfolk all drawn in by talk of a $500 bounty. They filled the other side. Colt was there too. He stood way in the back with one of the marshals beside him. The marshals. His hands were not tied, a small kindness the judge had allowed him. But make no mistake, he was a prisoner. He looked pale, his shoulders all stiff under a borrowed shirt. And his eyes? Well, his eyes were only for Evelyn. They were just filled with a desperate, agonizing love. Then Harlan Riggs showed up. He came busting right through the doors with three of his hired men in tow. The two that made it out of the arroyo alive in a new one. He was all gussied up in his town best, a dark suit, but his face was as purple as a prairie sunset with pure rage. "Judge Thorne," he boomed, stomping down the aisle. "What in tarnation is the meaning of this spectacle? This is a mockery. That woman there is my wife. She was stolen from me, led astray by that criminal savage." He pointed a fat finger right at Colt. "A branded man, a danger to decent womenfolk. I have a warrant." "You will hold your tongue, Mr. Riggs," Judge Thorne's voice cracked through the air like a bullwhip, "or I will have you gagged and bound myself. This is my courthouse. You will get your turn to speak, and so will she." He gave a nod to Evelyn. "Evelyn Riggs or Evelyn Hayes. Step on up, ma'am." Evelyn walked to the front of the room. She was shaking so hard she could hardly feel her own 2 feet. She had on that simple gray dress. She looked like a little sparrow facing down a hawk. "Mr. Riggs here claims you are his legal wife and that this man, Colt, took you against your will." Harlan yelled out, "He filled her head with lies. He forced her. Just look at her. She's scared to death of him." "Silence," the judge roared. He turned his cool, measuring gaze on Evelyn. "Speak up, child, and you speak the truth. The whole truth. God is listening, and so am I." Evelyn's eyes found Colt's across the room. He was watching her, his face a mask of pure agony. Believing he had ruined her life, she could see the pain, his fear for her. And right then and there, her own fear just vanished. She was not just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for him. She locked her eyes on his and she took a deep breath. "My name is Evelyn," she said. Her voice started out small, but it was clear as a bell, and it carried through that dead silent room. "And I am not his wife." "Liar!" Harlan screamed. The marshal took a step toward him. I was at a church," Evelyn went on. Her voice got stronger with every word, her eyes never leaving Colt. "But it was not a marriage, it was a sale," she told them. She laid it all bare. "My own father, you see, he had a gambling debt he owed to Mr. Riggs." A quiet rumble started moving through the crowd. He sold me. He sold my honor to settle his score and keep a roof over his head." That rumble got louder. The women in that hall were looking daggers at Harlan now, their faces just plain, cold disgust. "That night, what was supposed to be my wedding night, he brought me to his house, and he locked the door." Her voice cracked for just a heartbeat, but she forced it to be strong. He showed me the leather belt he planned to use, and the iron handcuffs in the drawer by the bed." A woman in the back let out a sharp gasp, a sound of pure horror. "He did not want a wife, Your Honor. He wanted something he could break. So, I broke the window. I ran. I ran for my very life. I ran in nothing but my wedding dress, with bare feet. I ran till I collapsed in the mountains, in the snow. I was dying." She pulled her eyes away from Colt and looked straight at Harlan for the very first time. He was just staring, his mouth hanging open. His pretend mask of a wronged man was gone, replaced by a look of pure, shocked fury that she would even dare to speak. "This man," she said, and her finger went up, not at Harlan, but at Colt. "This so-called criminal savage. He did not steal me away. He found me. He saved my life. He cleaned my wounds. He gave me food. He kept me safe. He never once laid a hand on me in anger. He is the only man in all my years who has ever treated me like I was a human being, not like a piece of property." She turned back to face the judge, tears streaming down her face, but her back was straight as a board. "I ran from that man," she said, pointing a shaking finger at Harlan. "And I ran to this one," she gestured to Colt. "That was a choice I made. I will not go back to him. If making that choice is a crime, then I suppose I am guilty. But I am not his wife." The whole room went dead silent. Judge Thorne just looked at Evelyn for a long, quiet moment. Then his eyes moved to Harlan, who was starting to sweat, his high and mighty act fallen apart. All his power in that room just vanished. He glanced at the faces of the ranchers and the trappers. He looked over at Obadiah. Then he stood up. "Mr. Riggs," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner. "This territory might be a wild place, but it is not without law. And the law here, my law, does not and it will not recognize the sale of a human soul. Not to pay a debt, not for any reason at all." He turned his gaze to Evelyn. "A marriage to be legal in my court requires the free and full consent of both people. It is crystal clear to this court there was no consent here. There was only force. It is also plain as day, from the defendant's own words, that marriage was never made official." He picked up that forged paper from his table and held it high. "Therefore, this court finds that no legal binding marriage ever took place between Evelyn Hayes and Harlan Riggs." He then tore the paper clean in two, a powerful gesture. "This marriage is hereby annulled, wiped from any and all records. She is a free woman." Harlan looked like he was about to explode. You can't. This is, and what about him? That warrant? He is a kidnapper, a branded criminal." The judge just raised a tired eyebrow. "A warrant for kidnapping, you say? Well now, you cannot kidnap a person who was never your property. And you certainly cannot kidnap a woman who, by her own sworn public testimony, is a free soul who went along willingly. As for his branded past, well, this court is not in Texas. Mr. Riggs, his actions here were those of a rescuer. The charges are dismissed. Marshal, let him go." The marshal took a slow step back from Colt. He was a free man. Colt just stood there, swaying a little, like he could not believe it. Harlan Riggs let out a roar of pure, shamed fury. He knew he had been beaten, not by the law, but by a slip of a girl and a room full of witnesses. He stormed out of that hall, his men scrambling right behind him. "This ain't over," he screamed. But the door slammed shut, and he was gone. That night, the little settlement was quiet. They had been given a small, private cabin. The threat was gone. The world was wide open and, frankly, terrifying. Evelyn was by the fire, brushing her hair. Colt was standing over by the window, his back to her, just watching the moon. He was so very still. "Colt," she said softly, we are free." He turned around. His face in the moonlight was not happy. It was haunted. "You are free," he said, his voice so low she could hardly hear it. You are Evelyn Hayes now. The judge, he wiped your slate clean." She frowned. "What? What in the world are you talking about?" He looked down at his own scarred hands. I am still me. I am the man from that prison farm, the branded man, the man who changed your life forever. You are free of Harlan. You are a proper lady again. You do not have to be tied to someone like me." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were raw with that old familiar pain, that deep down fear that he was not worthy. "Now that you are free," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Now that you can choose anything, anyone, do you still choose me? Do you still want me?" she asked, her eyes locked on his. She was looking at this handsome, good-hearted man who was a little bit broken, who had saved her life, and had seen her at her absolute worst. And now, in her moment of triumph, he was offering to set her free. A laugh started to bubble up from deep inside her chest. It was that same rusty, unbelieving, joyful sound from back at the cabin. It caught him completely by surprise. He just stared at her, stunned. She crossed the room, and that laugh turned into a sob of pure, honest-to-goodness love. She threw her arms around his neck, wincing when she bumped his sore shoulder. But she did not care one bit. "You silly fool," she whispered, her lips brushing against his rough cheek. "You absolute beautiful fool." She pulled back, cupping his face in her hands, making him look her right in the eye. "I was never his," she said, her voice full of fire. "I was never my father's property. When I ran into those mountains, I belonged to nobody, not even to myself." Then she kissed him, a long, deep kiss that was staking a claim, a kiss full of promises already made and kept. "I never belonged to anyone but you." They did not end up staying in the Valley of the Friends. It was a safe harbor, but it was not their home. The peace there was a quiet, borrowed thing, and these were two people who had been forged in fire. They needed a place of their own. Obadiah understood. He was a man who knew the hearts of people, and he saw they needed to build something, not just be given shelter. He offered them a piece of land, not as a gift, but as a lease they would pay for with their own sweat and hard work. "You'll pay with 100% of your effort," he had said, a kind smile in his eyes. "And then it will be yours." The land was on the northern edge of the settlement, high up on a mesa that looked out over the bay, wide open plains. It was wild land with a good stand of pine trees, a spring that ran clear and cold, and a view that stretched clear to the end of the world. It was a place you could defend. It was private, and it was theirs. The building of the cabin was the building of their life together. They started with nothing but their own two hands and the tools that Obadiah had lent them. Colt, his shoulders still on the men, worked with a focused, grim determination. He was a man remaking his entire world from the ground up. He felled the trees, his good arm and his healing arm, working together in a new awkward rhythm. Each swing of the axe was a declaration, a statement. "I am here. I am building. I will not be moved." Evelyn worked right alongside him. She, who had been raised to be a preacher's daughter with soft hands, now learned the hard bite of the tools, the saw, the heft of the adze. She cleared away the brush, her hands long healed from the canyon, now calloused and strong. She chinked the logs with a mix of mud and straw, her fingers carefully pushing the earth into every gap, sealing their home up tight against the wind. Then one day the Quaker men came, moving like a quiet, steady force. They didn't ask permission, they just showed up, and in a single afternoon they raised the beams for the roof. They worked in their plain clothes, and their movements were like a silent prayer spoken together. Evelyn, with her face smudged with dirt and her hair tied back in a rag, made them hot coffee and served the bread she had learned to bake in Ruth's kitchen. She sat and visited with the women who came along, and for the first time she was not a patient, not a victim, and not a runaway. She was a neighbor. The little cabin was a humble place. It was just one room like that trapper's cabin that had been their first safe haven. But this new one had two windows, and the door faced the sunrise. It was not a place to hide. It was a place to live. As soon as the cabin was built, Colt started on the fences. He split every rail himself, his body growing stronger as his shoulder healed, leaving a puckered, angry scar that Evelyn would gently kiss every single night. He was fencing in a pasture not to keep things in, but to mark out their own space. He was building a boundary against the rest of the world, a line of safety. Evelyn planted herself a garden. Ruth gave her the seeds to start. It was an act of pure and simple faith. She broke that hard, high country ground with her back aching, and she planted roots, carrots, potatoes, and onions. She planted herbs, the very ones Ruth had used to heal Colt. She planted corn. She was quite literally putting down roots. She was making a bet on the future. She was betting that this ground would be enough to hold them. Their life was simple, and it was brutal. The winters were harder than anything she had ever known. The winds a constant screaming fight. The summers were hot and dry, but it was all theirs. Every night they sat by their own fire in their own home. They ate the food she had grown and he had hunted. They talked about the day. They talked about the fences. They talked about the garden. They did not speak of Harlan or her father or that prison farm. Those things were ghosts, but their footsteps were finally fading. Their peace was something they had earned. It was not the soft, easy peace of folks who don't know any better. This was the hard, calloused peace of the ace survivor. It was built from every scar, every bruise, every tear, and every single moment of terror, each one a stone laid in the foundation of this new life. When he woke up in the dead of night from a nightmare, his hands would be reaching, not for her, but for a knife. She would gently take his hand and place it right on her heart. "You're here, Colt," she would whisper. "You're home now. I am right here." And when she cried out, her own dreams filled with the sour smell of whiskey and the glint of cold metal in a drawer, he would just hold her. He would not try to shush her. He would just hold on tight, his solid, scarred body feeling like a fortress, until her trembling finally stopped. "I've got you, Em," he'd rumble, his voice like a shield. "Am not letting go." That land changed them. It settled their souls. Evelyn, the runaway bride, became a real presence in the territory. She started out by helping old Ruth. She had a steady hand and a quiet way of listening that made folks feel heard. The women in the far-flung settlements, the wives of hard-drinking ranchers and desperate men on failed homesteads, well, they began to seek her out. She just had a way about her. She was not some Quaker preaching about peace. She was not a townswoman full of judgment. No, she was something else entirely. She was a woman who, by her own telling, had run for her life right out of a public hall. She became a midwife. She learned from Ruth, and she learned from the land itself. She delivered babies in little sod huts and in the back of covered wagons. But Lord, she delivered more than just babies. One afternoon, she sat with a young wife, a girl named Sarah, whose husband was known for a heavy hand. Sarah had a nasty bruise on her cheek that she tried to pass off as a run-in with a pantry door. Evelyn just nodded, offering her a cup of warm herb tea. "This pantry door?" Evelyn asked quietly, looking down into her own cup. "Does it ever lock you in?" Sarah's head snapped right up. "Doors are strange things," Evelyn went on, her voice real soft. "Some are for keeping the wind out, and some are for keeping a person in. I once knew a man who was mighty fond of locks and belts." Sarah's eyes just filled with tears. Evelyn did not preach. She did not judge one bit. She just said, "There is a judge, you know, a man by the name of Thorne. They say he actually listens to women. And there is a long road heading north. It is a hard walk, but it can be done. I happen to know a woman who did it. She was just planting seeds. She was helping women escape the very same fate she had once feared for herself. She was giving them the one thing that no one had ever given her, a choice." Colt finally found his own purpose. He was a man who understood horses, and Lord knows he understood pain. You see, that Quaker settlement had taken in a whole mess of orphan boys. They were children of the trail, left behind by sickness, bad luck, or just broken dreams. And these boys were wild, angry, and all busted up inside. Obadiah asked Colt to lend a hand with the horses, and with the boys, too. Now, at first, Colt was just plain terrified. He was the branded man, a danger to everyone. He figured he had no business being around children. But Obadiah just said, "He is fit to be around horses." He told him, "Those boys, they are just wild colts themselves. They need a gentle hand and a firm one, not a weak hand, and sure as heck not a cruel one." Colt soon met a boy, a teenager named Silas, who was nothing but pure rage and sharp edges. The kid had been caught stealing, and he treated the horses with a meanness that was just for sport. It was the kind of thing that made Colt's blood run cold. Then one day Silas struck one of the mares, a hard, open-handed slap. When she jumped back, Colt moved so fast Silas never even saw him coming. But he did not strike the boy. No, he just took his hand, the very one he had used to hit that horse. He held it tight. His grip felt like it was made of pure steel. The boy, scared stiff, tried to pull away, but Colt just held on. "She did not do anything to you," Colt said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The boy stammered, She tried to bite me." "She is afraid," Colt said, "just like you. You think being cruel makes you strong? It just makes you like the very people who hurt you." Then he let go of the boy's hand. He turned to the mare, and his whole manner just seemed to soften. He stroked her neck, his voice a low, calming murmur. "Easy now, girl, easy. He is just a fool. He does not know any better." Colt looked over at the boy, who was rubbing his wrist, his face a mix of pure anger and fear. "That horse did not make this world, son," Colt said, his voice steady and low. "It just has to live in it. Same as you. You are always fighting the world. And you are fighting yourself. You are supposed to guide a horse. You do not break it. You show it a better way." And right then he realized he was talking about himself. So he began to train the boys. He taught them how to ride. He taught them how to gentle the wild mustangs, not with whips and spurs, but with patience and with a quiet, steady presence. He was giving them a sense of worth he had never been allowed to have. He was giving them a real trade, and in healing those boys, he was healing a piece of himself. Life finally settled into a steady rhythm. The seasons turned, the garden grew strong, the pasture was home to 3 good horses, and the little cabin was warm. Then one night, deep in the summer, the air was perfectly still. They were sitting out on that little porch Colt had put up himself, just watching the stars. The sky was clear as glass. It looked like someone spilled a bag of diamonds across black velvet. It was so quiet, the kind of quiet that lets old ghosts get to walking. Evelyn leaned her head against his good shoulder. It is so peaceful, she whispered. I, I still do not trust it. Sometimes when it gets this quiet, I still feel afraid, she admitted. That small, dark seed of fear that she still carried inside her. The fear that none of this was real, that Harlan would just appear on the ridge, that the world would come along and take it all away. Colt was silent for a good long while. His arm tightened around her. He looked up at that vast, beautiful sky that did not care one bit. "So do I," he said, his voice a rough whisper. "Every morning I wake up and I check the door, just to make sure it is not the one on the prison farm. I check to make sure you are still there, that I did not just dream you." He kissed the top of her hair. His beard was scratchy against her skin. I reckon we will always be a little bit afraid. We have seen the dark. We know it is there, but it is different now." She looked up at him. "How?" "We are not alone in it," he said. He took her hand, weaving his scarred fingers with her calloused ones. "Love walks with us now." The months passed, that vibrant summer faded into a gold and brown autumn. The first snows of winter came, and the world was white and silent all over again. But this time they were in their own home with a full pantry and a warm fire. It was in the deep cold of winter that Evelyn knew. She had been so tired. Her body felt strange. She had missed her monthly cycle. At first she thought it was the work, the hard year, but then the nausea came in the mornings. She was pregnant. That realization did not come with joy. It came with a wave of ice-cold, paralyzing terror. A child here in this world. A world with men like Harlan. A world that would brand a man like Colt. A world that would sell off a daughter. She was terrified. She was terrified of the birth, a thing she had seen go wrong so many times. She was terrified of being weak, of being a burden. She was terrified of bringing a fragile new life into a place of such profound, brutal hardship. She cried, but they were not tears of joy. They were tears of pure, raw terror. And she hid it from him. Him. For a whole week she was quiet and pale. He knew something was wrong. He watched her, his gray eyes filled with a brand new kind of worry. But he did not push her. He just waited. And then she finally broke. He was oiling his rifle, making that familiar, steady sound in their quiet cabin. She was mending his shirt. "Colt," she said, her voice just a tiny choked thing. He stopped, the oil rag still in his hand. "What is it, Em? Are you sick?" "No, I am with child." The moment she said it, she covered her face with her hands, and a great big swab just tore right out of her. She was terrified that he would be angry, terrified he would feel trapped just like her father was, trapped by a life he never wanted. He was completely silent. The silence stretched on, filled only with her crying. She felt him move before she saw him. He did not say a word. He just knelt. He knelt right there on the rough wooden floor in front of her chair. This was a man, she thought, a man who had never knelt for anyone, not for a judge, not even for God. He gently, so very gently, pulled her hands away from her face. His own face was not angry, and it was not afraid. It was pure wonder. He was looking at her as if she had just reached up and hung the moon in the sky. A child," he whispered, his voice cracking. She nodded as a whole new wave of tears began to fall. "I am so afraid." "Afraid?" he whispered back, as if he did not even understand the word. He did not touch her face. He did not touch her hands. He reached out, his rough, scarred, calloused hand trembling. And then he laid it on her belly, so softly like he was touching a ghost. A tear, his own tear, made a track down his weathered face. Afraid, he repeated. He looked up. In his eyes were filled with a light she had never seen before. A fierce, protective, blazing light. Then I will build a world for the both of you. He bent his head, the branded man, the outcast, the killer. And he pressed his lips, his beard rough, his mouth him to her stomach, right through the plain wool of her dress. He kissed her, but he also kissed their child. It was a vow. The story ends in the spring. It always seems to end in the spring. The snows melted and the whole land was born all over again. Wildflowers, defiant and bright, pushed their way up through the hard ground around their little cabin. Purples and yellows and a fierce, vibrant blue. Evelyn was standing barefoot in the new grass, the earth feeling damp and cool beneath her feet. She was large with child now, her hand resting on the high, hard swell of her belly. Her rounded belly. She was gazing out at the hills. Then she saw him, just a dark speck moving against all that green. It was Colt, riding home. He was not running. He was not being chased by anyone. He was just coming home to her. A smile spread across her face, her hands stroking the curve of her belly. I got you, she whispered soft and low to herself, to the child and to the wind. You were so big and so broken, but I took you in, and now you are mine to keep always. He saw her then. He nudged his horse with his spurs, and Quiet, that faithful gray, broke right into a lope. He reached the fence line, and he did not slow one bit. He swung down from the saddle before the horse had even come to a full stop. Just like that day he had come to warn her. But this time his face was not all hard with fear. It was split wide open in a rare and beautiful grin. He reached her in 3 long strides. He did not hesitate. He did not ask. He just plain lifted her up. His strong arms, one scarred, one whole, just scooped her right up, lifting her pregnant belly and all clear off the ground. And she laughed. It was not the small, shy giggle of a young girl. It was not that rusty, surprised sound from back at the cabin. It was a full-throated, unashamed, glorious laugh of a woman set free. A woman who had been through the dark and had come on back. And in that laugh, in that one clear, bright sound that echoed out across the high, wild plains was everything. Every tear, every single scar, every long mile. It was the sound of survival. It was the sound of them. Well, thank you so much for listening to our story. We would surely love to know where in the world y'all are tuning in from. So please do leave a comment and let us know. If you enjoyed this tale, please think about subscribing to From Wild West. And we hope y'all will share your thoughts with us in English. We truly do appreciate you being here with us.